Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate-tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host on this Tuesday edition of the show. Hey, thanks so much, everybody, for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your work day. And a big shout out to everybody else listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast. It is great to have you here with us today. And Lindsay and I have switched. She'll be here tomorrow on Wednesday, and I'm here today, Tuesday. I'm broadcasting from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So hello, Saskatchewan. It's great to be with you. I'm here for a nutrient media event today. Looking forward. This day is going to be jam-packed. Touring, doing a mine tour, cool stuff I'm going to talk more about maybe a little bit later on in the week. So, I'm here for the Nutrient Media event, and there'll be stuff on RealAgriculture.com about it, and we'll talk about it on the show probably on Friday. And I've never been on a mine tour before, so this is going to be kind of cool. Well, I've been on a mine tour, like a coal mine, but I've never been on a fertilizer mine tour. Very interesting, very neat, way outside of the scope of something like a coal tour or something like that. So I'm looking forward to that indeed. Today on the program, we've got some pretty important discussions that some heaviness to them. We're going to be talking to Adam Dunst. He's a partner with Dentons out of New York. We're going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. This is the CTA. This is something that businesses in the U.S., you need to be paying attention to, our listeners, but also some of our listeners outside the United States. If you have operations in the U.S., there's certain criteria that will catch you, but you may need to register under the Corporate Transparency Act. This is something that was put in place. The deadline is coming up very soon here, but it was put in place to look at beneficial ownership relative to trying to prevent money laundering and things like that, but it casts a very wide net. So we're going to talk to Adam about that. We're going to hear from Ashley Bruner with the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity to talk about some new data relative to how consumers, how consumers feel about agriculture, their trust in farming, as well as maybe even some of their perceptions of things like the CFIA. There's some numbers that are working in the negative, and there's numbers that are, I think there's some positives to take from it as well. So Bern Tobin had a chance to catch up with Ashley last week at the Public Trust Summit. We're also going to hear from Andrea Kent. She's with RI Canada, the Canadian Biofuel Lobby Organization, to talk about how we've got some issues relative to corn-based ethanol and it not being corn-based ethanol not qualifying for funding under the Clean Fuel Fund. Okay, so that's some concern for the corn-based ethanol side of the sector in Canada. So we'll hear about that from Andrea. If you have any feedback on today's program, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms, or you can also call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to hear all about how consumers feel about farmers and agriculture with the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity right after this. Farmers, are you ready to boost your crop yields while improving soil health? ReSurge, the next generation humic product from Helena Products Group. Steve Cowan of Crop Management Network talks about why they sell ReSurge over other humic products.
That's what I liked when I heard about ReSurge, is that we can use it through an air drill and put it in furrow, which when I look at a humic product, I think that's where it should be.
Visit your local ag retailer or check out helenaagra.com. Put life back into the soil with ReSurge.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomist, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. Hey, along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there's a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more by going to smartnitrogen.com. That is smartnitrogen.com. Well, last week was the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity's Public Trust Summit that was held in Toronto. Real Agriculture's Bern Tobin was in attendance, and we talked about this a little bit on last Friday's show in terms of some of the interesting numbers, the decline when it comes to how consumers are seeing agriculture and farmers in general. Bern had a chance to talk to Ashley Bruner with CCFI and learn about some of this year's report and the results.
We've had this conversation year after year for several years now, and I guess I'm getting a sense, overall here, that we're seeing more public pessimism, indifference, maybe some cynicism creeping in here about our food system.
You're right. In fact, what used to be indifference is now increasingly becoming pessimism and negativity. We're seeing some drops in some core questions where people aren't just indifferent, they're actually falling into the negative category.
What's driving that from your perspective, Ashley? I mean, there's a lot of factors here. We have a lot of people trying to influence public opinion. There's so many sort of touch points. What do you see?
I think it's a couple things. One is that overall context of years of high inflationary pressures, followed before that of global pandemic. So I do think that people are a little bit tired, a little bit cranky, a little bit pessimistic towards everything. But we are seeing it specific to the food system as well. I think food costs, of course, are a driver of that pessimism. And it's hard to connect with Canadians. But this year we did some research and we found that even though many don't understand how food pricing is determined, those that do have more positive views of the Canadian agri-food system. So that public awareness and education and engagement piece around cost of food is important.
One thing that we've seen here as well, something we haven't seen in the past, is maybe a decline in, I guess, the perception of farmers as stewards of the land, and even the federal regulators, CFIA, and their ability to sort of regulate food. You're seeing a decline there.
We are. We're seeing a couple significant declines specific to those two areas. Farmers as good stewards of the environment, we are seeing a softening, which is worrisome. Farmers are generally viewed very positively. They're the most trusted. They're the most transparent. So any kind of movement related to that group is definitely something to keep an eye on. Distrust with CFIA and kind of federal government agencies. We are seeing that in the data as well, with the caveat that there's a political discussion going on and great dissatisfaction, so it might be a bit of a combining the two, the government and the political side of things.
Now, Ashley, I want to talk more about what's happening there, especially when it comes to trust. But before we do that, let's talk about some good news. You got some interesting numbers here. Canadians are less worried about some things that we've talked about a lot in the past and will continue in the future. Pesticides and drug residues, for example.
You're right. We're seeing significant decreases in concern on some of those key food and farming issues. What's at play to some extent was last year it was a bit of a high-level watermark of some of those concerns, and we're seeing a softening. So the drop in those concerns, it's not a record low, but it is kind of back to that middle ground that we typically tread.
You also did something interesting here. You looked at perceptions of different sectors, agriculture, education. And there, we talked about maybe some of the pessimism seeping into agriculture, but there was agriculture and food at the top of the list.
You're right. Agriculture and food is the most trusted industry in Canada, according to our research. We we're more trusted than healthcare, education, banking, all kinds of industries. So this is good news for our sector. Canadians are hard. Food is very personal. It's people have a lot of opinions on it, but overall, when compared to others, we are still quite trusted.
I want to dig into honesty, of something that you talked a lot about here. And over the years, there was always, and it continues, a need and a discussion about transparency. We have to tell people about how food is produced, what we do on the farm. But you're saying transparency now is not necessarily enough. People are looking for honesty. Tell us about that.
You're right. I've come up with a new trust KPI of honesty. After years of tracking trust and transparency as kind of those two key metrics, we're adding honesty into the mix. I think transparency, we're doing great. I think there's a ton of information out there, accurate, clear, trusted, objective, including our own research. But I think we're missing that human connection somehow. Canadians, there's still a disconnect, and it might be that honesty view. So this is our first year testing it. People think we're doing okay. Most are unsure. It's not as polarized as the direction of the food system, so that's more good news. So this is a good benchmark measure that we've instituted to build from.
Ashley, when we talk about trust, you mentioned cynicism, sort of becoming more and more prevalent in Canada. And when you talk about trust, you said, communicating in a way that people feel you are not trying to trick them. I mean, again, that's cynicism. How do you deal with that?
Consistency. Over time, we're not going to solve the fact that people do have their guards up when it comes to food-related information. I think it's a function of potentially bad actors where people can't trust information at sometimes, depending on who it comes from. So I think we all need to fight the good fight, be spokespeople of positivity and of objective, accurate information, and to really assure Canadians we're not trying to fool them, we're not trying to mislead them, we're not trying to bring them down a wrong path. We really are just trying to provide healthy, affordable food for themselves and their families.
Final thing, and that is, building on that, you talked about some of the messaging buckets that continue to sort of, be something that farmers and the food community can lean on. And, the three of them, really starts with the food system and the critical role it plays in the health of Canadians.
Yes, we did some message testing around some core areas related to food and farming, and we were happily surprised to hear that Canadians recognize our important role in their lives when it comes to social cohesion, when it comes to economic impact, when it comes to providing nutritional food. Canadians strongly agree, over 9 in 10, that we are critical in those roles. So that is good news. Canadians, at the heart of it, do understand the important role that we play.
Well, great insights as always, Ashley. Really appreciate you making some time for Real Agriculture. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
That was Bern Tobin of Real Agriculture reporting from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity's Public Trust Summit outside of Toronto, talking to Ashley Bruner from CCFI. Some interesting stuff, and I wanted your feedback on what you heard. There's some interesting takeaways there. What stuck out to me was consumers giving some mixed messages. So on one hand, not more concerned about or less trusting of CFIA, yet feeling some positive results when it comes to residues and trust in food. Very encouraging that the industry of agriculture rates very high in comparison to some other industries. So there's some kind of a good news, bad news sandwich there. Some of it not totally making sense or not necessarily completely aligned. But the reality is we can't expect the consumer to be all-knowing. And we talked about this on Friday's show on the RealAg Issues panel. I think Tyler McCann from Cappy made this point. We can't really expect the consumer to be all-knowing when it comes to the inner workings of the agricultural food system. But obviously, some work to be done there. It is all not perfect. But yeah, that stuck with to me why Canadians are a little bit more negative now on CFIA than in the past. And we if we see a total increasing distrust of the regulator, that becomes a problem long term for the agricultural sector because that's probably if you asked a lot of Canadians, what does CFIA do? They probably couldn't, they might not be able to tell you. So we got to be careful how much we read into some of this data, but very important work being done here from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. Would love to get your feedback on it. What were things that stuck out to you from that conversation? Some concerning things, or what were some of the pieces you picked out that you feel very positive about, that you think are very encouraging, or we should be building off of? You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Hey, let me tell you about New Farm. Yes, they've got some great pre-emergent soil active herbicides, Valterra EZ and Fierce EZ. Get ahead of hard-to-kill weeds. Spray this fall for up to 8 weeks of extended weed control next spring. Find out more about New Farm products at newfarm.ca. We're going to take a break on Real Ag Radio. When we come back, we're going to hear from Andrea Kent from RI Canada. The Clean Fuel Fund is not going to include funding for corn-based ethanol. Why? And is this a problem? You're listening to Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM.
Get ready for tillage season with the high-speed disc from Brandt. Cut and size residue, create ideal seed beds, and level ruts faster than any other tillage machine. It's a better field finish and fewer passes, so you can stay on schedule, no matter what fall throws at you. And right now, you can get yours with a $12,000 rebate. There's never been a better time to bring your operation up to speed. Visit Brandt.ca for details.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
If you only listen to Real Ag Radio, you only get half the picture. For greater insight into the issues that affect farming, tune in to RealAgriculture.com. Crops, livestock, machinery, farm management, and the markets, even food and travel. Real Agriculture Online digs deeper into the topics that affect the way you work and live. So get connected today. Read, watch, and listen to the people who know at RealAgriculture.com.
And welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on this Tuesday edition of the show. Shaun Haney, your host. Make sure you check out RealAgriculture.com. We can only get so much content into this hour-long program on an everyday basis. We got a ton of stuff that doesn't make it to the airwaves. We appreciate you listening to us on Sirius XM on Rural Radio 147. We appreciate you listening to the Real Ag Radio podcast. Check out RealAgriculture.com, and you can subscribe to our morning newsletters that are free by going to RealAgriculture.com/subscribe. Hey, calling all Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and northern Minnesota growers, the new Seed Omega-3 canola production system can help you unlock a guaranteed path to market with attractive premium opportunities. They've also got first-in-class agronomy support and this is important, free on-farm pickup after harvest. You can learn more by going to omega3canola.com, a great opportunity for canola growers in the northern tier to take advantage of some extra premium by growing a really, really cool specialty product from New Seed. That is omega3canola.com. Okay, now we're going to talk about biofuels. Yes, and a lot of times we talk about biofuels from an American perspective. This is a Canadian biofuel story. There's been a decision made by the Natural Resources Board that that manages the Clean Fuel Fund that corn-based ethanol will not qualify for those dollars. I had a chance to catch up with Andrea Kent of RI Canada. RI Canada is the industry group for biofuels in Canada. They are concerned. Here's my conversation with Andrea Kent. First of all, what is the Clean Fuel Fund?
So we've got to back up a few years to get to the origin story. But essentially, the Clean Fuels Fund is part of the federal package to complement the clean fuel regulations and was designed as a funding incentive to build out domestic capacity for whether it would be renewable fuels production, maybe implementing some large-scale shovel-ready emissions reduction technology onto fuel production, and really became, I think, one of the government's preferred tools in addressing some of the competitiveness issues that came out a couple of years ago when the U.S. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was announced. So we are kind of living through the second iteration of this Clean Fuels Fund. It was announced a few years ago. There was an intake that was part of that process. Admittedly, it was pretty slow. The government admits that it was difficult to get out the door. So as part of the last federal budget, the government announced what they described as a retooled Clean Fuel Fund. And really, this was something that a lot of industry was waiting for. This was welcome news for us. We were excited about the relaunch of the CFF. And the message at the time was, it's going to include the same fuels. It's going to include largely the same kind of criteria and parameters, still aimed at that same, kind of focus on domestic production and clean fuel production in Canada. And this retool was really just to streamline it. The budget language was a little ambiguous. We followed up with folks, growers and RI Canada and some of the other stakeholders that we work with across the supply chain. The message that we heard was, everything is all set. We just want to make sure that we get the streamlined aspect of it right. When the proposed criteria came out on what this new fund was going to look like and what was eligible for it at the beginning of the month, however, we saw there in writing that ethanol was proposed to be ineligible as one of the big changes. And this is what we've been working on, right? Like why this lockout, why this ban on ethanol being ineligible now when it's part of all of the other clean fuel programs the government has. It's a big part of the U.S. IRA. And it was eligible in Clean Fuel Fund 1 as well. And that's the change we're talking about.
And just to clarify, what if it is ineligible for the Clean Fuel Fund, ethanol would be ineligible for what?
So it's a pocket of money, right? So this is a repayable kind of contribution that we would, as an ethanol producer in Canada, be eligible to apply for. So, I think, it's up to, 25 million. I think the original envelope was a bit larger, right? But it's how can we access some funding that would incentivize us to invest further in ethanol production in Canada, further in clean technology for ethanol production in Canada, especially when we are up against now this U.S. IRA reality where you see really generous, really, explicit credits to incent and subsidize U.S. production.
If this stays as presented, Canada is already the largest importer of U.S. ethanol. Does this enable that to get even bigger, or what's one of the outcomes here?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because when we talked to Natural Resources Canada about this change, this ethanol ban, essentially, they listed the fact that the Canadian ethanol market was already being served by imports, which is true. I mean, open and free trade certainly exists. But I think it is bizarre to kind of misinterpret that and use imports as a justification as to why you would make domestic producers ineligible for the program. And by extension of that, exactly like you're saying, it does slant towards favoring imports even more than is, already the case because of the U.S. IRA benefits. And if U.S. ethanol is favored, by extension, imported, that feedstock is also going to be American ultimately as well, too, that's going into that product. So there's definitely some cascading consequences that hopefully, this is corrected. The ask here is really just to make all low carbon fuel pathways eligible. It shouldn't preclude anything off the hop.
So there's confusion here because the clean fuel regulation, ethanol is important in that regulation, correct? So is this government policy working against itself?
I think there's definitely a misstep, and we really hope it can be corrected. Where we're at right now is we're still waiting for the final criteria to be announced for the Clean Fuel Fund. It is in consultation right now. So, I think when you look at the disconnect between ethanol as being not only a big part of the clean fuels regulation, it is the biggest part to date. When you look at Environment Climate Change Canada's own report, it was pretty resounding that ethanol right now is the compliance fuel of choice to reduce those emissions. It's also the most affordable one. So in addition from all the local farm and agricultural opportunities that ethanol creates here at home, it's also, depending on, other kind of market conditions, it's always lower wholesale price than gasoline. So, in the US again, where you have, ethanol at 15%, there's studies in the States that are showing that those drivers who are using 15% ethanol are saving like 30 cents a gallon. So, it's affordable, it's homegrown, it is the biggest lever right now in terms of reducing transportation emissions. Again, going back into, it's awkward, it's bizarre that it isn't eligible for the only clean fuel fund that we have right now.
Is it typical for a body like Natural Resources Canada to make the decision, hey, we're going to go with the imports over producing it? Like, is that typical? Like, do we do this in other areas? Like, why?
Not that I'm aware of. And, you've called out, the Clean Fuel Regulation is Environment Climate Change Canada. The Clean Fuel Fund is Natural Resources Canada. So, this isn't the only time that we see those silos. It's just a reality sometimes of how these programs are structured and designed. I think part of the challenge for, anyone in government right now, certainly, program officials who are looking at these programs, I think they've had a hard time, really grappling with the generosity of the U.S. IRA and the speed with which the U.S. IRA, was announced and implemented. Those two things are, very, very impressive, very difficult to match. But that's not to say that you can't match the direction of the U.S. IRA. And the direction that the U.S. IRA is taking is that it supports their domestic American ethanol producers and the American growers in their domestic market. And the direction right now that the, proposed Clean Fuel Fund has presented us is the opposite direction, unfortunately. So hopefully by calling that out, there's still time to reverse course, correct on this. And it's happening at the same time too, where, our partners in agriculture, like farmers in Ontario, we know that they want to see support for ethanol production. They would love to see more ethanol production. They want to make sure that that continues to be a market for them. Ontario farmers are investing in techniques for higher yields, which is really, really positive, and they need a market for that corn. We want to provide it for them. But, small decisions like this, or I should say decisions that seem focused and small, like excluding ethanol from a clean fuels fund, actually have much bigger implications. The investment signals that sends is potentially really, really hard, right, for, domestic producers, investors, farmers, which is really, I think, the core of the issue here is the direction.
So which fuels were given preference then?
Well, I mean, it kept all other existing pathways unchanged. So, including, obviously, renewable diesel, biomass-based diesel. It has, provisions for sustainable aviation fuel, which is positive. The only exclusions that are really different are on ethanol. There was a decision to not have hydrogen included, but the rationale there is that since kind of the first iteration, the government has introduced a clean investment tax credit for hydrogen production. So there is a support program for hydrogen. That's not the case for ethanol.
You mentioned the IRA several times, the size of it, the speed at which it deploys funds. Can we have something of the equivalent? Is that possible? Or what are we striving for here?
So apples to apples, I think, no, it's not. And I'm not the only one who's suggested that. I think there's a lot of pragmatists that, that look at it and, think that, if we were to try to compete dollar to dollar, that's not the most, practical place for us to put the effort. I think where we can match the IRA is in terms of clarity, in terms of focus, and in terms, again, of just, what is the trend direction that we're trying to do? And, it's very, very clear that it's an industrial policy. It's aimed at capacity, right? The direction is for job creation, growth, and to, really anchor markets that, are important to local communities and, absolutely farmers as well. And then just try to keep pace on the timeline. So it's really positive when, programs like the Clean Fuel Fund are reannounced and are retooled and recapitalized and are, ambitious in trying to get money out the door. But, you hear it time and time again. It's the details that really decide the day.
Yeah. Well, in the U.S., it's not an easy path for ethanol. There is always fights to be had and, trying to hold ground and battle. There's lots of fights between the EPA and USDA. There's a lot happens there. But at the same time, there's a lot of support for biofuels. I mean, look at the candidates of all stripes go through states like Iowa proclaiming their love for biofuels. Yeah. That culture, those events do not exist in Canada. What has to change in that regard? Why such a difference for countries that are just right beside each other?
Yeah, I think, going back to kind of the fundamentals into what really made our initial renewable fuels standard in Canada, as well as the US, why it was such a success and why it created the build out that it did was because there was a really, really close tie with agriculture, and it was oriented towards capacity, growth, production, right? Local benefits that actually matter to people. A lot of the environmental benefits stemmed from that. It came after because communities were doing the right things, because, we had, producers and farmers working in tandem, and, the government created programs that were really, really clear and really accessible, and importantly, didn't preclude things at the front end. Right. So you didn't see exclusions at the front end of something. It depended on your technology. It depended on, your investment process. It depended on your business plan, right? The strength of your logistics chain. That's what should be deciding these policies, not, kind of precluding things at the onset. And I think, climate will continue to be important. I think, sustainability continues to be something that a lot of people do care about. But, just looking at the climate that we're in right now, I think it's reasonable to put the focus back on what are your job creators, right? What is anchoring economic drivers here at home? How do we make sure that without compromising trade, we are anchoring investments and we are making sure that, our communities are well served? And I think that's what the real issue is here. Doesn't necessarily have to do with competing with the US IRA in terms of, is this a credit versus a grant? Is this, an investment credit versus a production credit? It's really is this making sense for us here, our producers and our growers and the jobs that they create, right? And we've got to get those details right.
Andrea, thanks a lot for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me again.
That was Andrea Kent of RI Canada. It seems bizarre to me that at a time where on the U.S. side of the equation, in the U.S., they're trying to figure out how to prop up and have more domestic production of biofuels. In Canada, and we're already purchasing a large amount of U.S. ethanol, like we discussed with Andrea there. We're actually making the decision that, you know what, maybe it's better we just import U.S. product instead of even really putting up really any sort of an effort in Canada. We're not saying we don't like corn-based ethanol. We're not saying that we're not going to use it. We're not saying that, you know, we need to prevent it from being used in the market. We're basically saying let's just take the option. It's easier just to bring in U.S. product. And we need to, you know, I'm not saying that we don't bring in U.S. product. I think it's an important supply. And it's a high quality product. It doesn't mean we also can't have a Canadian industry at the same time. This is, I don't understand sometimes the decisions that are made in government whatsoever. I want your feedback on it. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Hey, when we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. This is impacting U.S.-based businesses, but if you're a Canadian corp operating in the U.S., you may also have to file under the Corporate Transparency Act. And there's some stiff fines if you don't. We're going to talk to Adam Dunst of Dentons when we come back. But first, I want to talk about your co-op grow team. They stay up to date with the latest research and technology to help support your entire operation. Talk to their team for advice tailored to your farm's needs. Co-op, here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more by going to co-op, that's co-op.crs/farm. We'll be right back right after this.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Shaun Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio, delivering reliable agricultural lab testing for your crop, soil, feed, water, and seed. SGS is uniquely positioned, ready to elevate your business in Canada and the United States. Call them now at 1-800-952-5407. That is SGS, 1-800-952-5407. We're now going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act, better known as the CTA. A lot of concern about this in the United States, but it also potentially impacts you as a Canadian corp or listeners abroad that are operating in the United States if you meet certain criteria. I had a chance to talk to Dentons lawyer Adam Dunst. He is a partner out of New York. Here's that conversation.
Thanks, Shaun, and thanks for having me on the show. Really excited to talk about the CTA with you, and look forward to speaking.
Yeah, not every day, probably being a partner in New York, you get to talk to farmers and ranchers across Canada and the U.S., but this is going to be a great opportunity for you.
Sounds like a great audience. Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, first off, high level, what is the Corporate Transparency Act, and what is it trying to accomplish?
Good question, because it is a confusing topic, and knowing what it's trying to get at really is helpful to help understand. So the Corporate Transparency Act, and more specifically, we're going to be talking, I think, about the Beneficial Ownership Information Reporting Rule under it, or the BOI rule, and we refer to the Corporate Transparency Act as a CTA. That really came into effect at the beginning of 2024, and its objectives, or primary objectives, are to help combat anti-money laundering, tax fraud, and other crimes. Basically a way of the U.S. government to get at shell companies and, get into ownership and try to prevent those bad things from happening. The U.S. had realized that it was ranked pretty high on a bad list, which was a list of, secrecy and ownership of, of companies. And, in order to bring it in line with a lot of what jurisdictions around the world are doing, it implemented this law and these rules, which basically, covers, entities that are either formed in the U.S., by filing, or foreign entities which qualify to do business in a U.S. state by filing documents are subject to the reporting, and that's really beneficial ownership and control reporting.
Is it my understanding here is that, as you described, targeting money laundering activities and things like that, but casting a pretty wide net. And so there are people now, or companies, entities that have to disclose or register, and we'll go through what that looks like. And it had never even thought about having to potentially do this sort of out of this is sort of out of their normal daily activities in terms of thinking about this kind of stuff. Has this cast a pretty wide net?
It has, Shaun. There are a handful, I'd say about 23 exemptions or something like that. But many of them don't apply to entities that are businesses that people otherwise may have thought, they would apply. So, the average client, thinks, there must be an exemption for us because this is kind of out of the ordinary, and it really is a revolutionary kind of law that's been implemented. But more often than not, there is no exemption that's directly applicable. Whether you're a mom and pop business that's filed an LLC to do business somewhere in the U.S., or you're a cross-border agricultural company, there may or may not be an exemption that applies, but it is a very wide net, and it will capture a lot of companies in that.
Okay, so let's talk about who does apply to, and how do you determine if you're included or not?
So the first thing to look at is if you have any entity, whether it's an LLC, corporation, or otherwise, and you either formed it in a state in the U.S. or a tribal jurisdiction by filing a document, filing a piece of paper with the Secretary of State, perhaps, or if you have a company or other entity that is not a U.S. company, say a Canadian entity, but you have filed a document to do business, qualified to do business, say in New York, Montana, anywhere in the United States, you would, that entity would be captured. Also, if you're a conglomerate and you have lots of entities and you're based in Canada, but you formed one entity as a sales arm in the United States, somewhere down your corporate chain, that entity would be picked up as well.
Yeah, my understanding is you're a Canadian, it could be like a Canadian company that has a contract to operate, or you have some sort of activity in a U.S. state. Pay attention to some of the language in terms of in that contract, how it refers to abiding by the laws or regulations in that state. You need to be careful of some of the fine print and how some of those contracts are even worded, correct?
Right. Well, if you're looking simply at a contract, contract between two companies, that alone wouldn't pull you into the CTA. But if you are talking about an LLC agreement, say for a joint venture, and the Canadian entity maybe formed with a U.S. entity, a joint venture, and you formed it in Delaware, or any state in the United States, then you're going to be, pulled into that. And if you're merely an owner, a beneficial owner of a business that's subject to reporting, then again, you can get pulled in by, being a substantial owner or substantial control person of that business.
So what are the reporting requirements?
So it's another good question. The company itself would have to report, and that includes reporting the company's full legal name, the company's address, where its principal place of business in the United States is, the company's IRS number, and then the company would have to report, which of its direct or indirect human beneficial owners own 25% more of the company's equity or have exercised substantial control over the company. And we could talk about that in a minute as well. But then when you get those individuals, you have to list those individuals' full names, their addresses. You have to get unique identification numbers from government in respect to those individuals. Could be on their passports or on their driver's licenses, and then copies of those identification documents also have to be submitted.
And the timelines here, this came into effect January 1st of 2024, is that correct?
Correct. And so there's a few different timelines that apply for entities formed before 2024, you have basically until January 1st, 2025 to file, your reports to comply. For any entities that were formed in 2024, you had 90 days from the date of formation. And going forward into 2025 and thereafter, you'll have 30 days to file your report. Then there's also anytime any of the information changes that should be picked up on the report, you have 30 days to file an amendment to the report. So that would cover changes in ownership, that potentially changes in, CEO. Lots of different changes can trigger those updates.
And who am I filing with again? Is that the Treasury Department, or who am I doing that with?
Treasury Department, specifically the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise, commonly referred to as FinCEN, and then they're part of the Treasury Network, Treasury.
Now, I was in a meeting where I was first exposed to the CTA, and I was listening, and okay, yeah. And then I heard the penalties. And then I was like, whoa, pretty substantial financial penalties for non-compliance. And even jail time was mentioned as one of the consequences. So talk about some of the penalties here. This will grab the audience's attention for sure.
Yeah, so is another really good point. There are both civil and criminal penalties, available for willful violations of the law. And the civil penalties, it could go up as $500 a day, which is inflation adjusted. So I think it's almost up to $600 a day now, with a cap of $10,000 on that. But then there's also up to 2 years in prison for willful violations of the act. And that's causing a lot of people to get very stressed out because they're notwithstanding the fact that there are FAQs released by FinCEN on how to comply and what to do. There are lots of scenarios that just haven't really been thought about, or clearly described by FinCEN. So, attorneys like us are getting lots of questions, in that respect.
Yeah, that's why we're having this conversation. Now, there's a lot of integration between the Canadian and U.S. economies, for example, Mexican and U.S. economies as well. Is this grabbing on, is this grabbing onto a lot of businesses, or what should we do? Should we go through the process of talking to a lawyer and that has expertise in this area, not just, a local that maybe, does the odd business contract for you or a mortgage, talking to a lawyer that has expertise and seeing if you are caught in the net, or is that the best first step, or what should we do as businesses?
Yeah, I think that is the first step. You're going to want to have, your corporate organization, handy and know where you, where your companies are, where every company in your organizational structure is, subsidiaries and all that. And I would definitely recommend reaching out to sophisticated counsel that has, background in interpreting and understanding, US AML regulations and the like, because it could get complicated. There may be exemptions that apply to some, but not all of your entities. You could be potentially fully exempted. There are lots of different things that have to be analyzed and looked at. And another thing that would be a good first step is if you know that you have a U.S. entity, say that you formed years ago and you haven't used it for anything, 5-10 years, but it still exists. It's still out there. It hasn't been formally dissolved or wound down. I would recommend thinking about winding it down now before January 1st, because if you don't, notwithstanding the fact that it hasn't been used for anything in years, that would get picked up by these pretty broad sweeping regulations, and you'd have to report based on that inactive entity that still, however, exists.
Yeah, my perception here in talking to people is that this is there's not to be messed with. There's sort of this default we have where it's this won't apply to me. You sort of said this in terms of the exemptions, but be careful here.
Yeah, especially with the civil and criminal penalties. And, we haven't really seen it been enforced yet. I think the FinCEN is still in the process of letting companies, really file and kind of populate their database and, of information. And, but I would expect that we will start to see some enforcements, going forward. And, you would not want to, be caught up as any kind of example, enforcement. So you should definitely look to comply. FinCEN's also made public comments where they suggest if you're not 100% sure if an exemption applies or not, to err on being over-inclusive. And of course, these are conversations to have with your board, your attorneys, but they are interpreting it pretty broadly and suggesting compliance.
Do they have the resources in order to handle this level of companies this potentially applies to? They're trying to go through this process of seeing if they have to comply or not.
Well, that's another good question. But the chances are they will focus, like law enforcement, often does, on areas, maybe industries or areas or things that they get flagged as red flags, and will focus their efforts there.
Does it create any potential legal or operational challenges for Canadian companies or Mexican companies that are trying to operate in the U.S. as a result of the CTA? Like, does it thicken the border, so to speak?
Yeah, you'll have to likely adopt more compliance, guidelines internally. A lot of non-U.S. companies, say Canadian or Mexican companies, will rotate executives, overseas or across the border here to the U.S. when they have a subsidiary or joint venture or some other operations in the U.S. And they may have short rotations, long rotations, but even that would trigger changes in filings to FinCEN just by the fact that you sent somebody else to be an officer of your U.S. operation. And you'll really have to have these procedures in place in order to make sure that you can comply and that you're up to date on your compliance. And there are, of course, other items like handling of personal identifiable information. You're going to have to start collecting this information, copies of passports, driver's license, dates of birth on people, and you'll want to make sure that you're complying with all local laws. So you'll have to also reach out to local counsel, in jurisdictions where you're collecting that information, be it in the U.S., Canada, Mexico, or from persons overseas that also are involved. So it really touches on a lot of things that will require a lot of thought to go into compliance and operational procedures to address all these items.
Yeah, well, agriculture is very much a cross-border business: livestock, grains, oil seeds, and so I think there's a number of our audience that is going to want to check and see what they have to do from a compliance standpoint when it comes to the Corporate Transparency Act. Adam, thanks so much for joining us here today, shedding some light on it, and a bit of a rude awakening, so to speak, for a lot of us to check this out.
It was my pleasure, Shaun, and thanks for having me.
Some heavy fines there that come with the Corporate Transparency Act. That's something you want to make sure you get some advice on. If you are operating in certain states in the U.S., just talk to a lawyer that has the experience and the knowledge in this area and just find out. Make sure that you are not out of line, because those penalties are quite stiff. If you have any more questions about it, send me an email to get you in contact with Adam if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, when we come back on RealAg Radio, we'll finish up the show with some fan feedback right after this. You're listening to RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. And it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance. Improved crop safety. Enhanced weed control. And a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with the Fall ESN application. Learn more by going to smartnitrogen.com. Covered some pretty heavy ground here today. Want to get to, you can give me your feedback on any of that, but I want to get to some of your other feedback. And I got a series of emails from a listener hearing some of the concerns I've had about Canada-U.S. relations relative to potentially a Trump presidency if a week from now the Republicans are successful and win the White House. And sort of challenging me on, what are my thoughts and questions regarding what happens if the Democrats are to win. And I think it's a good question. I think a lot of times Canadians jump to the conclusion that Republicans, especially in the time of Trump, is going to somehow be way worse than any other situation. And maybe taking a little bit more of a negative tone there, as if that hasn't been or won't be the case under the Democrat side of the aisle. Now, to be fair, traditionally, Republicans very friendly towards trade, Democrats a little bit more protectionist. I think those lines are a lot more blurry in today's environment. Now, I do believe, and I wrote this before the Biden presidency, that a lot of Canadians assume because it wasn't Trump, that Biden was going to be spectacular for Canada. There's been Product USA that has come into play under the Biden administration. Okay, which is very concerning for Canadian pork and beef trade. So to say that somehow it's going to be just glory days if it is a Harris presidency, I think would be a little bit foolish. Indeed. Now, what we're going to have at the back end of the week this week, okay, is we asked our Real Agri Studies Insights panel about this. What do you feel a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency would be better for Canadian agriculture? You also could choose one of the candidates, or I don't know, or the other option was they're about the same. To be honest with you, I may choose about the same. Now, it's just different. One's maybe a little bit more chaotic than the other, but the other one maybe a little bit smoother, seem calmer, but a little bit more quietly going about their way as opposed to some of the brashness. So I think I would probably choose about the same. Time will tell. We'd obviously got to get a winner to the election first, but we did ask the Insights panel that, and I'm going to have that information on Friday's show for the Real Ag Issues panel. So look forward to that. Actually, Friday in our email, we're going to have a U.S. election special for you. A number of different stories relative to breaking down the potential impacts of the election, things to be looking to as we find out who the next president of the United States is going to be. So if you don't get our daily e-newsletters, you want to do that by going to realagriculture.com/subscribe. Now, if you have any feedback on today's program, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find Real Agriculture across all different social media platforms. You're also more than welcome to call the Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. This is Shaun Haney, and want to thank you for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Radio, and we will chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.